2140, Claude responded, Andrew Berry sat down and answered questions this week, and I want to give you my honest read on everything he said, because some of it confirms what we've been. Andrew Berry sat down and answered questions this week, and I want to give you my honest read on everything he said, because some of it confirms what we've been tracking all offseason. Some of it adds important nuance, and one specific answer about the four-quarterback room is being discussed in ways that I think fundamentally misrepresent what Berry was actually communicating. Let me walk through all of it carefully. Start with Taylon Green, because that's where most of the post-interview conversation has been focused, and I think the framing around it has been missing the actual point. Berry drew the Malik Willis comparison himself, not as a definitive projection for Green's career, but as a pointed reminder of something specific about how quarterback evaluation works versus how it gets covered. Willis came out of college to widespread skepticism, 4 starts, and people were writing permanent verdicts. He got traded for essentially nothing, went to Green Bay, sat, developed, got his real opportunity, and played at a genuinely high level. Now he's a starter in Miami. Berry's point isn't that Green will replicate that exact path. His point is that the pattern of making sweeping career conclusions based on tiny sample sizes is one of the most consistent and most damaging mistakes in NFL evaluation, and he's watched it play out close enough to understand exactly what it costs when organizations fall into that trap. 2 of his own young quarterbacks have played fewer than 8 starts combined, and certain voices were already ready to declare permanent judgments on both of them. Berry is pushing back against that mentality directly, and he's right to do it. What Green actually represents in this roster construction isn't complicated when you see it clearly. He is not competition for Shedeur Sanders in any meaningful Week 1 sense. He is not a threat to Watson's organizational position. He's a legitimate future insurance policy and a specialized package option. A player with a 43.5-inch vertical, Mountain West Freshman of the Year, Mountain West Offensive Player of the Year in his second season, and enough arm talent and physical profile to operate in a run-pass threat role that gives Monken schematic flexibility the rest of the quarterback room doesn't provide. Monken is an offensive coordinator by background and training. When he looks at a 6'4" quarterback who runs a 4.4 40 and jumps 43.5 inches, he doesn't see a developmental project waiting for a chance. He sees a puzzle he wants to solve. Green gives him a piece that nobody else in that room provides, and the cost of acquiring that piece was minimal enough that the organizational flexibility it creates is pure upside. Now let me get to what Berry said about Shedeur directly, because this is where the substance of the interview matters most for understanding where the quarterback situation actually stands. His characterization of Shedeur's offseason was specific in ways that sounded like genuine coaching staff evaluation, rather than the diplomatic non-answers that GM press conferences typically produce. Noting specific improvements in decision-making and pocket management, identifying those as the concrete areas where Shedeur showed observable growth by the end of last season, and continuing that development into the spring. That's the kind of precision that reflects actual internal feedback rather than public relations management. You don't identify those specific growth areas with that level of detail unless you've been watching closely enough to know exactly where the gaps are and what the improvement trajectory actually looks like. Berry also stated his expectations for Shedeur in year 2 clearly. More command of the offense, better ball security, improved situational awareness. Those are exactly the developmental targets that coaching staffs set for quarterbacks they're genuinely invested in rather than simply managing through a competition. That specificity creates an evaluative chain that I think is worth naming explicitly. The coaching staff designed the practice structure around Shedeur's development. The practice produced visible improvement in the specific areas they'd identified as priorities. The front office is registering and crediting that improvement publicly. That chain describes organizational alignment around a player's development trajectory, not organizational uncertainty about whether that player is the answer. The voluntary minicamp performance provides the concrete context that makes Berry's characterization feel grounded rather than aspirational. The 80% completion rate in 11 on 11 reps on day 1 wasn't just an impressive number in isolation. It was a demonstration of the processing speed and decisive triggering that Monken's system specifically rewards, the ability to confirm the post-snap read fast enough to act on it before the window closes against real NFL personnel. Berry, seeing that and noting it as evidence of positive development, connects the practice structure to the organizational expectation to the visible on-field result. The loop closes in one direction. The Watson question is the one that gets most politically complicated in these conversations, and I want to give Berry's response its honest treatment. He declined to describe Watson as having any inherent competitive advantage despite his experience. He said experience is a strength Watson brings to the room, which is fair and accurate, but that it doesn't in and of itself constitute an advantage in the competition. He said both Watson and Shedeur have worked hard, and the organization is pleased with how both have started the offseason program. That framing is deliberately balanced, which is exactly how a GM manages a competition he can't formally resolve until training camp evidence arrives. But the balance of his language sits differently when you examine it closely. The developmental praise for Shedeur was specific: concrete growth areas, concrete year 2 expectations, concrete acknowledgement of spring improvement. The praise for Watson was more general: effort acknowledged, trajectory unspecified. One sounds like a coach describing a player he's actively investing in. The other sounds like appropriate professional courtesy toward a veteran in a complicated organizational situation. The distinction is real, even if it's subtle enough to be easy to miss on a quick read. The collaboration question about how Barry and Monken make decisions together produced what I think was the clearest and most operationally significant answer of the entire interview. Barry said it plainly: who plays is Todd Monken's call. Full stop. The GM handles personnel acquisition. The head coach handles lineup decisions. And Barry framed it in a way that removes any ambiguity about the organizational structure around this specific question. If he couldn't trust Monken to make the lineup call, he'd have the wrong person in the job. That statement does more than describe organizational structure. It removes the question of Barry potentially overriding Monken's quarterback judgment from the table entirely. This decision belongs to the head coach, which means everything Monken has communicated through practice structure, rep distribution, the captain designation, the helmet cameras for processing analysis, the unequal first-team allocation, all of it reflects a process that ends with Monken's judgment and stays there. The front office isn't going to be pulling the quarterback situation in a direction different from where the coaching staff's evaluation points. The Emmanuel McNeil-Warren discussion is where Barry offered his most analytically transparent moment in the entire interview. He said he genuinely doesn't have a definitive explanation for why Warren fell as far as he did, but offered a couple of reasonable hypotheses. Scheme specificity. Warren may appeal most strongly to defenses running 3 safety systems, which narrows his perceived market even if his raw talent is broad. And the secondary wave phenomenon. When a position group's top players get clustered in draft discussion, the second tier at that position sometimes runs later than their evaluation supports because the early conversation absorbed all the available attention. Barry compared it to what happened with Jeremiah in 2021, an undersized but explosive player who fell farther than his talent level justified because scheme-specific concerns narrowed his perceived market. Warren arriving in Cleveland as what the safeties coach described as a big old heart player. The sticky note on Barry's computer before the pick, the genuine internal enthusiasm rather than compensatory fill, tells you this wasn't a value pick made because a higher priority was gone. It was a targeted priority that fell further than expected and delivered disproportionate return as a result. The broader picture of what this draft class represents for Shedeur Sanders is the analytical frame that makes individual selections make sense. Spencer Fano at 6 addresses the structural failure that produced the worst pressure rate in the league last season. KC Conception brings the quick game and vertical threat profile the receiving core was missing. Denzel Boston adds the 6'4" contested catch presence that changes pre-snap defensive alignment on the outside. Austin Barber in round 3 doubles down on offensive line investment because Barry and Monken clearly understood that one pick couldn't fully address an infrastructure failure that severe. Warren brings the ball-hawking instincts that create turnovers and favorable field position. And Green gives Monken a specialized tool and legitimate long-term backup option at minimal organizational cost. Every selection traces back to a specific documented need in the environment around the starting quarterback. That's not coincidence. That is an organizational philosophy expressed through premium draft capital. Barry's comments about development and patience deserve more weight than they've gotten in the post-draft coverage. He said explicitly that the NFL doesn't tend to exercise patience or understand that development is a non-linear process, but that's not how his organization operates internally. He drew a specific contrast between how external evaluation rushes to judgment on small samples and how the Browns are actually thinking about their young quarterbacks' trajectories. Coming from a GM in the middle of a situation where external pressure around the quarterback room has been constant and relentless for months, that statement is a form of organizational commitment. He's saying clearly that the patience required to develop a quarterback correctly is a value he's operating from, not a talking point deployed for consumption. The Willis example is the proof of concept, a player everyone wrote off who eventually played at a high level when given real preparation and real opportunity. Barry watched that happen close enough that the lesson is not abstract for him. He's applying it to his own situation, with full awareness of what patience actually requires when the external pressure is pointing in a different direction. The AFC North context that closed the conversation deserves acknowledgement because it's the competitive reality that makes everything Cleveland is building either matter or not. Baltimore remains the divisional favorite, Pittsburgh has quarterback questions of its own. Cincinnati carries health concerns and defensive vulnerabilities. And Cleveland, with a top 5 defense already in place, is adding meaningful offensive infrastructure around a young quarterback who showed genuine things in limited action under the worst possible conditions. Above 500 feels like a realistic floor when I look at the full picture of what this roster looks like now versus what it looked like entering last season. The defense doesn't need to be rebuilt. The receiving core has been upgraded with differentiated profiles across multiple levels. The offensive line has received the most targeted investment in years, and the quarterback at the center of all of it has been in the building all offseason, posting 80% completions in 11-on-11 reps, earning a captain designation before the competition formally closes, and watching his front office back the organizational belief in him with the most concrete resource available. Premium draft picks deployed at the positions that determine whether he develops in a functional environment or a broken one. The AFC North should be paying attention. The pieces are finally coming together.